All right, guys, I'm here on a disgusting day to take you around and show you old CBGB and tell you a little bit of its history and what led up to it. Here on the Bowery. If you can't read that sign right behind me. Eric, how you doing?
Dry.
You're dry for now. Just wait until we get outside. It is brutal outside. Well, anyways, before we start, guys, check out the Patreon. That's how we fund these things, how these things are going to grow. You know, there's extras on there, per usual, and also like and subscribe. That's a big help. Otherwise, guys, gotta go out and brave the elements now. This will be a nice quick video because I don't really want to be outside too long, but I'm going to give you some good information, baby. That's all that matters. Eric, what do you think? Should we just start this thing?
Let's go.
CBGB, punk music, the Bowery. Let's go. Okay, so before we talk about the, CBGB and the downtown art scene, the downtown music scene, I'm gonna start with talking to you about the Bowery, which is where CBGB was located. To kind of set the stage, this is all important stuff. So the Bowery is actually one of the main thoroughfares, has been one of the oldest thoroughfares of Manhattan and New York City since its beginning. It's called Bowery because Boerderij was the Dutch word for farm. And it led out of the city and to all the farms of the city, including eventually Peter Stuyvesant. Peter Stuyvesant was the Director General of New Amsterdam, who was booted when the British took it over in 1664, and his farm was pretty much the East Village. So it was called Bowery, and it also led out of the city where the Collect Pond was located, where the Five Points eventually became kind of the neighborhood. And because it was kind of its own thoroughfare, it didn't really belong to the Five Points, and because it was a main thoroughfare, it also started to house arts. So, for example, the Bowery Theater, one of the biggest theaters in the country, was open there in the early 1800s, now in what is today Chinatown. And it also became like a haven for not only the people from the Five Points and all the, the people like the gangs of New York people, but also the well-to-do who wanted to come see shows because theaters open there. It became kind of the predecessor to Broadway and home to minstrel shows, aka blackface, and also tap dancing, which was invented here, with the Irish jigs and things being taken up by a lot of the black dancers and stuff. Anyways, in the 1870s, the elevated railway is built, and it creates kind of a nightmare area. No rich people, no nice, well-to-do people wanted to go there anymore because soot was raining down, it was dark, making it more of a haven for the ne'er-do-wells, the people who like to drink and go to saloons and fight and all that stuff. So it becomes kind of a dump until the 1950s when that elevated railway is taken down. It still took a long time to kind of pick itself back up. You can kind of see the old Bowery in movies like On the Bowery, which is a really cool like slice of life film, kind of half documentary, half narrative about it. I don't want to plug other people's movies for too long, but that was in the early 50s. Anyways, it's a real dump. It's all saloons and like prostitution, lots of what they call flop houses. Lots of flop houses, places where.
Flop houses, right here,
Yeah. Well, I saw you wiping the thing. I got to repeat it.
What you're talking about.
Anyways, it's flop house where you can like pay like $1 and literally have like a spot on the ground to sleep in. Lots of drunks and things like that in the area. And it was here that CBGB eventually opened its doors. Now, before CBGB opened its doors, some things needed to happen. Music was kind of coming up in the city. Obviously, it was always kind of a center for music. But it was really the DIY scene that eventually became the punk scene that kind of paved the way for the popularity of CBGBs. And we'll cover one of the things that happened in that scene, a very important event that kind of paved the way, at our next stop. What do you think, Eric? Should we go?
I think maybe we should go.
It's freezing. We're getting wet. We're really sacrificing our bodies here for you guys. Let's go to the next spot. All right, so before we get to CBGB, we got to set the stage for its kind of opening, right? So I'm actually here at 240 Mercer Street, which was the site of the Mercer Arts Center. Now, a little bit of background. It was located inside a building that was previously known as the Grand Central Hotel. It was opened in 1870. It had a crazy history, actually. Throughout its history, Leon Trotsky actually came here and took his name, they say, from the deli that was located here called Trotsky's. The guy was named after a deli. I guess it's a good thing he wasn't, frequenting Quiznos or something because, would have had a different Russian history. But anyways, the hotel continues throughout the early 1900s. It changes names to the Broadway Central Hotel. Then by the 1960s, it becomes the University Hotel, and it's basically a dump. They're renting rooms for like $5 a night. And this guy named Art Delgado, who actually was the mind behind the Village Gate Theater down in Greenwich Village, where people like Bob Dylan used to play all that stuff, he decides to open the Mercer Street Arts Center using the first 2 floors, and they open tons of little performance spaces and start renting them out pretty much for like DIY. This is like in 1971. So it opens, they start playing music here, and bands like the New York Dolls take up, residency here. The New York Dolls actually had a weekly show here. Now, you may not know who they are, but they were one of the most influential bands of the early 1970s. They were making a push towards, they dressed in like drag and, and makeup, and they were just kind of sloppy musicians, but they didn't give a and a lot of people kind of went and saw them, and this was like the new definition of what cool was. People who went to see them included like the Ramones, future members of bands like Television, etc., and they kind of were inspired by them. They were one of the most influential bands that you may never have heard of. Bands like Guns N' Roses, all these people took a lot of influence from them. They started playing here weekly. Problem was, on August 3rd, 1973, the building collapses. Yeah, it just falls down. Falls down, in the afternoon, like around 5 p.m., the building just falls down. It was a pretty crappy building, obviously, like a lot of buildings in New York are, and it just kind of fell. And that was the end of the Mercer Street Arts Center. This place that had provided a space where artists could just put up their own shows, could do whatever they wanted, didn't have to pay lots of money, just disappeared overnight. And it did house other things too. The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, one of the earliest productions of that was here. Rip Torn was a member and performer here. So it was a very kind of important space for people kind of trying to make it on their own. But it disappeared, setting the stage for our next stop. Eric, what do you think of that? Did you ever heard that story before?
It kind of scares me, buildings falling down.
Yeah, buildings do fall down. Yeah, they do, unfortunately. If you ever hear a creaking in your house, it could be someone upstairs going to get milk at night, but it could also be your building falling down. But
I live in a kind of $5 a day art center, so.
Yeah, I think most of us do. Do you heard of the New York Dolls before, Eric?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, a pretty interesting band. They aren't a part of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and when asked about whether they should be included, the former lead singer, David Johansen, said, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is like Madame Tussauds, and I don't go to Madame Tussauds, so he's like kind of saying, who gives a shit? Which is kind of interesting. So after the actual Mercer Arts Center, fell, today it's actually part of the NYU Law School. This is the dorms here. So, a bunch of future comedian, YouTuber, law students are living here now. Yeah, I used to go to law school. All right, let's move. Oh, don't mind me, just laying here against the wall casually to tell you that everything we've talked about up to now has led us to this point, huh? We're at 315 Bowery. This was the site of CBGB. Now the story is that a man named Hilly Crystal actually opened a bar here in 1969 called Hilly's. It was kind of a biker bar, it was kind of a dive. And then in 1973, he had the idea of turning it into a music venue, partly because of, the lack of music venues here in downtown. Think of, Mercer Arts Center falling down, which is always weird. You're just like, hey, you want to go down to Mercer Arts Center, check out some bands or something? No, it actually fell down. The whole building fell down. So he thinks about opening a music venue. Initially, it was going to cater to a different crowd. He named it CBGB OMFUG because it stood for Country, Bluegrass, Blues, and Other Music for Uplifting Gourmandizers. A gourmandizer is someone who devours or eats, in this case, music, right? Now, initially he wanted it for country, bluegrass, and blues, but there was like I said, there was a lack of venues for, DIY, what eventually became punk, this electric and sloppy type of music. So he eventually opened his doors to those bands. In 1974, in March, Television makes its debut here. Then later that year, the Ramones make their debut here. Now, the Ramones were a band from Queens. They took the name Ramones, actually. Do you know where they got their name, Eric?
No idea.
This is kind of cool. So Paul McCartney used to check into hotels as Paul Ramone, as an alias. And Dee Dee Ramone said, we should name ourselves the Ramones, And so each one of them took their name and just added Ramone at the end, which is kind of interesting. Kind of cool, right?
Amazing.
Ah, yeah. The Beatles' influence extends into punk rock. Anyways, they play here in 1974, and they become a huge hit. Hilly Crystal actually remembers saying that he thought Television and the Ramones sucked. He didn't like their music, but they were a huge hit. People describe them as just a wall of sound, just complete energy. Their songs were like 2-3 minutes long tops, but the energy they provided and just like, completely let go. They were dressed in, leather jackets, a total, like, it was a show. And people just fell in love, even when they didn't really like the music at first. It was like an experience. Other bands followed shortly after. Blondie, Talking Heads. It became kind of a staple of the neighborhood. A magazine called Punk was actually started by a guy named Legs McNeil and his friend John Holstrom, and that was one of the reasons the label Punk got associated with this type of music, because it covered the downtown music scene. Also at the same time, bands were coming up in the UK and other parts of the country, but it really kind of was at the forefront here at CBGB. What Punk was it was kind of just like this attitude, it was kind of like this hearkening back to music in a simple way. Music in the early 70s was what was considered rock and roll, had gotten away from like the messiness and the grit of it, and so it was kind of a hearkening back to that. And it was, it was raw. It was, they weren't exactly the best musicians, but they really didn't give a shit. Then the Ramones toured Europe, went to the UK, and really spread their kind of aesthetic and music, and became a huge influence. And then obviously in the 1980s, continued on, and actually one of the big movements that was housed here was the hardcore movement. Bands like Bad Brains, the Misfits came and played here. Lots of different hardcore bands, and in fact Hilly Crystal eventually banned hardcore shows towards the end of the 80s because there's too much violence. Continued throughout the 90s, and they saw other bands kind of come here to play for nostalgic purposes, Pearl Jam, other bands as well because of its importance. But it slowly started to kind of decline. And then in 2005 actually, the rent was going to be raised to $19,000 a month, and they owed $90,000 in back rent to the BRC, which is right there, which took over where there used to be a flop house right above the CBGB. They ended up fighting in court. It was back and forth, but they ended up having to close their doors in 2006. Hilly Crystal was actually planning on opening CBGB in Las Vegas, but he died shortly after it closed of cancer, unfortunately. CBGB became a huge brand. They actually have the original awning at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. The Madame Tussauds. But yeah, it all kind of happened right here at 315. And in fact, the John Varvatos, which is like a super fancy, I guess, clothing store, opened there in 2008, and it kept the wall there. The wall is still there. But it was just this dive bar that kind of represented the do-it-yourself attitude of this neighborhood. And this is a funny thing. Hilly Crystal, when he opened CBGB, only had 2 rules for the music there. 1, you had to set up all your own crap, and 2, you only could play originals. Because that was another thing. People were playing covers and all that stuff. You could only play originals. Didn't matter how terrible it was, but it had to be original. And that was kind of cool, and that kind of describes what everything there was. Even if it wasn't musically proficient or whatever, it was original, and it kind of birthed a movement here in what was Skid Row. So it's interesting how the neighborhood, being as crummy as it was from a long time before, kind of set the stage, as did the events of like the Mercer Arts Center collapsing, and the bands and music that were influencing music at the time, like the New York Dolls and all the people watching them, and then the opening of this venue by a man named Hilly Crystal, who kind of was a little bit of a visionary in that sense, and he pivoted. He saw an opportunity, pivoted. So it's kind of interesting how that all kind of went into play here at 315 Bowery.
End of an era.
End of an era, and I guess every chapter that ends begins a new chapter. Is that a quote?
Sure.
Should be. It's not. Anyways, I think that kind of about does it for this spot. What do you say we go and wrap this up, Eric?
All right, let's go.
Let's go. Very artistic. All right, guys, well, we're done. We're out of that horrible weather. My feet are soaked. I'm tired. Eric, how are you doing?
Pretty warm, pretty dry, pretty good.
Good. I don't believe you, but good. Well, we covered a lot, guys. I not only to give you the history of CBGB, I also hear those rats having fun. I also told you a little bit of background on the Bowery itself, which, by the way, I should cover in a video, and I probably will here in the very near future, and also the lead up to the music that was born at CBGB. But guys, before we take off, please check out the Patreon. It's huge help. That's how I fund these things. There's some extras on there. Also, like and subscribe helps bump us in the analytics ahead of all the documentaries that have thousands of dollars at their disposal. But guys, that's pretty much it. There's a train coming, so it's going to ruin our sound. Eric, you ready to go?
Let's get on the train.
Awesome. Let's get on the train. I'm going to give him his $100,000 fee and get out of here. See y'all later. Sick.